Okay, so this is a brief summary session on types of experiments. There are 4 types of experiments that you need to know and be able to define and evaluate. This is a lab experiment, a field experiment, a natural experiment, and a quasi experiment. And today we're going to talk briefly about each of these. So let's start off with the 2 main types of experiments that we use, that we study in psychology. And this is a lab experiment and a field experiment. And this is where there has been direct manipulation of the independent variable by a researcher, by the experimenter. That is fundamental to both of these types of experiments. Of course, what is different about these types of experiments is that a lab experiment is conducted in a controlled setting, so this often involves the participants travelling to the researcher's setup or situation, whereas a field experiment, although still including a manipulation of the IV by the researcher, it is done in a more naturalistic setting, a much more normal habitat for those participants, and therefore often involves the researcher or experimenter having travelled to that location of the participants. Now, fundamentally, because there is still manipulation of the IV in both of these by a researcher, we can refer to collectively lab and field experiments as true experiments. They are the only 2 types of true experiments. Now, there are various strengths and weaknesses of lab and field studies, and that will be discussed in another session. So, the other 2 is a natural experiment and a quasi experiment. Let's start with what a natural experiment is. So, a natural experiment is where there is not a manipulation of the IV from an experimenter. In fact, the independent variable is naturally changing. So that variable would have changed even if the researcher wasn't there. So it really provides an opportunity for researchers to investigate variables, changes in variables that perhaps would not have been possible to either manipulate in the lab or field. Most likely probably because of ethical reasons or practical reasons. And we will shortly go on to have a look at examples of these. Natural experiments have therefore high ecological validity, and they do share many of the advantages of a field experiment. However, because there hasn't been manipulation of the independent variable by a researcher, we don't have the presence or the benefits of aspects like random allocation. So it could be that inherently we are suffering from people bias, individual differences across groups, because of course it is a naturally occurring independent variable. So what's a quasi-experiment and how is it different to a natural experiment? A quasi-experiment is when we are specifically looking at an existing difference, often between people. So a quasi-experiment is very much about a pre-existing IV, for example, gender, male and female, age, young and old, or it may be something more to do with a psychological disorder, phobic versus non-phobic group, depressed versus non-depressed group. They are pre-existing differences between people, and therefore there is no manipulation, there is no naturally changing variable that is investigated. It is pre-existing. It simply exists. Now, this can often still be conducted in a controlled environment. A quasi-experiment doesn't necessarily mean that it's still done in a natural field setting. In fact, you could quite easily, for example, bring a group of individuals into the lab and give them a memory test to do, and then look to see whether girls did better than boys. You would be essentially using gender as an independent variable, but because you didn't manipulate it, because it was pre-existing, it is a quasi-experiment. It is not quite a true experiment. So we can still conduct these in the lab and the field, but again, the same issues apply with a natural experiment, is that because they are naturally pre-existing groups and differences between people, there is no random allocation, and therefore there is significant risk of the influence of many confounding variables.